Arizona Territory, 1879. The sun was just rising over the red ridges near the San Pedro River when Florence Ellery realized she was not going to survive the day unless something changed. She stood barefoot in the hard-packed dirt outside the cabin, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching smoke curl from the chimney. Her wrists were raw from last night, her lips split. The desert air stung everywhere. Inside, Abram Coyle, the man nearly 3 decades older than her, stirred his coffee like he had not slammed her against the wall hours earlier. He had a way of acting like nothing ever happened, like pain was just something a woman took in stride. "Fetch water," he said without looking up. Florence didn't move. He stood slowly, that familiar scrape of his chair a warning. "I said." The sound that cut him off was a horse approaching fast, hooves pounding over dry earth. Florence's head snapped toward the trail, heart leaping. It was not one of the ranch hands. It was not a neighbor. No one rode like that here. Not with that kind of purpose. The rider came into view and the world shifted. He wore no hat. His long black hair blew back as he rode bare-chested, the sun glinting off copper skin and silver armbands. He sat tall on a painted horse, eyes fixed on the cabin, on her. Florence's breath caught in her throat. Abram stepped out onto the porch, shotgun already in hand. "Get back inside," he barked at her. "Now." But Florence didn't move. Her bare feet held to the earth like roots. The Apache chief brought the horse to a stop only a few strides away, dust rising around him. He was younger than she expected, no more than 35, but his face was carved with something sharp and ancient. His eyes never left hers. Then he spoke, voice low but clear. "She does not belong to you." Abram lifted the shotgun. "The hell she doesn't. I will not let you keep her." Florence's heart slammed in her chest. The chief's words weren't a warning. They were a promise. Abram cocked the gun. The Apache flicked his wrist. Florence never even saw the knife leave his hand, but she heard the clatter of the shotgun hitting the porch boards. Abram screamed, clutching his arm where blood poured down his sleeve. The chief dismounted in one smooth motion. He came to her side, his hand reaching out, not grabbing, not forcing, just offering. "I am Ziah Kade," he said. "Come with me. You are safe now." Florence's throat tightened. She looked at his hand, strong and steady. She looked back at the cabin, at Abram on his knees, cursing. And then she took Ziah's hand. He lifted her onto his horse like she weighed nothing. She held onto him, her hands trembling against his chest, and they rode fast, the wind tearing past them, the cabin shrinking behind them until it was just dust. They did not speak for a long time. The desert opened wide before them, red and gold and endless. Florence leaned against him, her cheek brushing his shoulder. For the first time in months, she felt air flowing into her lungs like it belonged there. "How did you know where I was?" she asked. His voice was quiet. "You helped my sister once. When the soldiers came, you hid her, gave her food. My people remember." Florence blinked hard. That had been nearly 3 years ago. A girl no older than 12 shivering behind her barn. "I did not know you were forced to marry him," Ziah said. "Not until word came from the trading post. He paid my uncle," she said. "I did not have a choice." Ziah's jaw tightened. He said nothing. They rode all day, stopping only to water the horse. When the sun began to sink, he led them into the shelter of a rocky ravine. The colors of the cliffs burned orange and soft rose. He built a fire with practiced hands, quiet and efficient. Florence sat across from him, watching the flames dance between them. She was still in her nightdress, still barefoot, but the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of Ziah's presence calmed the panic that had lived in her chest for months. He glanced at her once. "You are safe now." Florence nodded, but her throat was too tight to speak. After a long moment, Ziah unwrapped a bundle of dried meat and corn cakes, setting them gently on a flat rock between them. "Eat," he said. Her fingers shook when she reached for the food. "Thank you." Ziah sat back, his eyes on the fire. "You do not need to thank me." But she did. Not just for the food. For the way he had looked at her like she was not something owned. For the way he had stood in front of that cabin and made the world change. That night, she slept curled near the fire, wrapped in a blanket Ziah had given her. He kept watch from a ledge above, his silhouette still and sharp against the stars. When she opened her eyes in the morning, he was already cooking something in a dented tin pot. The smell of coffee and corn porridge drifted on the breeze. "I should not have left like that," she said, sitting up slowly. "He will come after me." Ziah handed her a tin cup. "Let him come. He will not take you again." They broke camp soon after. The journey was longer this time, winding through canyons and dry riverbeds. Ziah led her to the camp of his people, hidden deep in the Dragoon Mountains. She expected mistrust. Instead, the elders welcomed her with quiet nods. Ziah's sister, Nelly, now a young woman, embraced Florence like she had been waiting years for that moment. They gave her clothes, a place to sleep, a world that did not hurt. Over the next days, Florence began to breathe easier. She helped grind corn, collect herbs, wash linens. She laughed with Nelly one afternoon and it startled her. She had forgotten what it sounded like. Ziah watched her, always near, never overstepping. When she looked at him, he looked back like he saw her for who she was, not a thing broken, but someone worth guarding. One evening, as the sun slipped low, Florence found Ziah sharpening a blade by the fire. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat from his skin. "You risked everything to take me from him," she said. "I would do it again." "Why?" He looked at her, then really looked. "Because the first time I saw you, you gave what you had to someone in need. You did not ask for thanks. You just did what was right. I have not forgotten." Florence reached out slowly and touched his hand. He let her. "I do not know what comes next," she whispered. "We make something new," he said. "Together." And in the flickering light, she saw the truth in his eyes. Not pity. Not duty. Love. Quiet, steady, real. Florence leaned into him, her forehead resting against his. His hand came up, brushing her cheek with such care her eyes burned. She had never been claimed before. Not like this. Not by force, but by love. The morning after the first frost, Florence walked with Nelly beyond the southern edge of the camp, where the tall grass bent in silver arcs and the cottonwoods along the dry wash still held their last yellow leaves. The air had a brittle quiet to it, as if the land was waiting. Nelly knelt beside a cluster of low plants and began plucking dried seed heads into a woven pouch. Florence crouched beside her, copying the motion, careful not to snap the brittle stems. "They call this chile naba," Nelly said, voice low. "You boil it for fever, or crush it with water for a salve." Florence ran her fingers over the dry leaves. "Is it for children?" "For anyone," Nelly said, then glanced at her sideways. "But children need it more often." Florence didn't answer. She focused on the pouch, the way the seeds made a soft ticking sound as they dropped in. Later, as they walked back toward camp, Nelly asked without looking, "Do you want your own shelter?" Florence paused. "I hadn't thought about it." "It would be yours to build," Nelly said. "But we help each other." Florence nodded. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. That evening, Ziah returned from hunting with 2 hares slung over his shoulder. His steps were quiet, but Florence always knew when he was near. She stood from where she'd been mending a tear in a boy's tunic and met his eyes. "You found them quickly," she said. "They were careless," he replied, kneeling to clean them. "The wind shifted in our favor." She watched his hands move with practiced ease. When he finished, she handed him a clean cloth to wrap the meat. Their fingers brushed. "I want to learn to track," she said. He didn't speak right away. "Then you will." The next morning, before the sun was fully over the ridge, Ziah took her out past the last of the mesquite, into the rocky hills where ibex had once roamed. He showed her how to read the ground, how to see what wasn't obvious: a bent blade of grass, a single pebble turned wrong. She crouched beside a print barely visible in the dust. "This one's fresh." 2 hours, maybe less, he said. She was moving slow, heavy with young. Florence pressed her palm into the edge of the print. "How do you know it's a doe?" He looked down at her. "You'll learn." They didn't catch the animal that day, but she didn't mind. When they stopped to rest beneath a shelf of red rock, she leaned against it, her legs aching from the climb. Ziah sat beside her, his arm just close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. She broke the silence first. "I used to think quiet meant something was wrong." Ziah looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And now I think maybe it means something's right." He didn't answer, not with words, But he reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. Back at camp, she began gathering branches for her own shelter. Nelly showed her how to shape the frame, how to weave the willow together so it bent instead of breaking. The work left her hands sore and her shoulders raw, but she didn't stop. Ziah came to her just before dusk, watching her tie the last binding across the frame. "You've done well," he said. "I'm not finished," she replied, brushing dirt from her skirt. "But I'm proud of it." He nodded once, then looked toward the horizon. "There's a meeting of elders tomorrow. I want you there." Florence hesitated. "Will they allow that?" "They will if I ask." She didn't answer right away. Then, all right. The next day, she sat beneath the council shade alongside Ziah. The elders spoke in quiet tones, their words measured and few. They discussed the river drying farther north and what to trade for salt this winter. One elder, a man whose eyes were clouded with age, turned to Ziah and said something in a low voice. Ziah answered without pause, glancing briefly at her. After the meeting, she followed him back to the edge of camp. "What did he ask you?" she said. "If you were staying." "And what did you tell him?" Ziah stopped walking. "I said yes." Florence looked at him for a long moment. "Then you didn't ask me." "You're right," he said. "So I will now." She stepped in closer. "I want to stay." That night, she slept inside her own shelter for the first time. It was still rough, the walls thin, the roof not quite even. But it was hers. And when she woke to the sound of breath outside the door flap, she opened it and found Ziah sitting near the fire he'd lit for her. He didn't speak. He just looked up at her, and the world felt steady. She sat beside him, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "The fire's low. I'll keep it lit," he said. And she believed him. By late November, the cold had settled even in the low valleys, and the wind rolled down from the mountains with a sharpness that searched through furs and wool alike. Florence had lined her walls with pine boughs and stitched a curtain of deer hide across the doorway. It wasn't warm, not completely, but it held the worst of the wind at bay. At night, she slept wrapped in a quilt Nelly helped her sew, the stitches uneven but tight. Ziah had not entered her shelter since the day she finished it. He brought with sometimes or dried meat, but always left it near the door without a word unless she spoke first. She knew it wasn't distance. It was patience. One morning, Florence found him alone, seated near the ridge above the wash, carving a shape from mesquite. She sat without asking, pulling her shawl tighter around her arms. "What is it?" she asked, nodding toward the piece in his hand. "A bird," he said. "For a child's game." She watched the blade move in small strokes. "Yours?" "No. My cousin's son." He paused, then added, "I had a daughter once." Florence didn't speak, waiting. "She died in a fever 2 winters ago," he said. "She was 4. Her mother followed soon after." "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, but didn't look up. "I stopped carving for a long time. Only began again this month." Florence reached out slowly and touched the edge of the wood with one finger. "She had a name?" "Taya." She let the name sit between them, feeling the weight of it. "I would have liked her. She would have watched you build your home and asked for a hammer of her own." Florence smiled faintly. "I'd have given her one." That night, Ziah didn't leave the fire after supper. He stayed seated beside her, his legs stretched out toward the heat. "You've made a place here," he said. "Even the elders see it. I didn't know I could. You've always known. You were just told not to." She turned her face toward the flames. "I used to think strength was something loud, something that fought and shouted. But it's not. It's in choosing," he said. "Even when others try to choose for you." Later, as the fire burned low, he reached into the folds of his coat and pulled something small from a wrapped cloth. It was a ring, carved from juniper, smoothed and darkened by oil. The top held an inlay of turquoise, the color of shallow river water. "I made this for you," he said. She looked at it, her breath catching. "I don't give it to bind you," he continued. "Only to mark what has already begun." Florence reached for it, her fingers brushing his. Then she slipped it onto her hand where it rested warm and light. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you." Ziah's hand closed over hers, and for the first time he leaned forward and kissed her. It was not rushed or fierce. It was quiet, like everything between them had been measured, certain, real. When they parted, she didn't look away. "I want to share my home," she whispered. Ziah stood without speaking, then offered her his hand. She rose, and they walked together through the hush of the camp, past the tents and low fires, past the dogs curled in sleep and the slow drift of smoke into starlight. Inside her shelter, he waited for her to cross first. She did. They lay beside each other beneath the quilt, and for a long time neither of them moved. His arms slipped around her waist, and she pressed her face into the space between his shoulder and chest, where his heartbeat moved slow and sure. Outside, the night deepened. The wind passed overhead, but it did not reach them. By mid-December, the higher ridges wore a soft coat of snow, and the days shortened into pale, gold-lit hours. Florence had begun to wear wool-lined moccasins, and a cloak Nayli helped her stitch from elk hide, the seams tight against the wind. The mornings came quiet, and each evening she returned to her shelter with Ziah beside her, the space between them no longer uncertain. One afternoon, as they walked the length of the canyon trail collecting dry scrub, Ziah paused near the edge of a narrow ledge. Below them, a hawk circled, gliding low over the arroyo. "There's a place I want to show you," he said, resting his hand lightly at her back. They followed a narrow path along the slope, the rocks warm with late sun despite the cold. The trail curved through a break in the cliffs and opened to a small plateau, half-shielded by a stand of juniper. It was quiet there, untouched. A shallow spring seeped along the far edge, feeding a patch of green even now. "I came here often after Taya died," he said. "I didn't speak. I just listened." Florence knelt beside the spring, dipping her fingers into the clear water. "It's beautiful." Ziah crouched beside her. "I want to build a place here. For seasons ahead." She looked at him, the slow meaning of his words settling between them. "You mean for us?" He didn't smile, but his eyes held something steady. "I do." Florence stood and turned to take in the space. "We'll need stone. And cedar from the lower grove. You'll choose the shape," he said. "I'll follow." They returned to camp as dusk settled, the air sharp with wood smoke. Ziah peeled bark from cedar posts while Florence worked beside him, binding dried reeds into mats for the roof. They spoke little, but the rhythm of shared labor filled the space between them. Later that week, word came from a northern traveler that soldiers had passed through the Mormon settlements, asking questions about a white woman with dark hair and an Apache escort. Ziah gathered with the elders that night. Florence waited just outside the circle, her hands balled in her shawl. When he stepped away from the fire, she walked with him into the shadows beneath the cottonwoods. "Will they come here?" she asked. Ziah's jaw was firm. "Not unless someone leads them." She looked up at him. "Would they try to take me back?" "If they do, they won't reach you." Florence pressed her hands to his chest, her breath shallow. "I don't want to run again." "You won't," he said. "But if we must move, we'll go together." She lowered her forehead to his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her long past when the fire's light faded. The next morning, Florence rose before first light. She walked to the elder woman's tent where medicines were kept and asked to learn how to prepare the blackroot tea and firebalm. The woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded once and motioned her inside. By late moon, Florence could tell fever dreams from spirit sickness, and she'd learned where to gather desert moss after snowmelt. The work gave her something firm to hold, something of her own to offer. One evening, as she returned with a pouch of dried horehound, she found Ziah waiting beside her shelter. He held a narrow strip of leather in his hands, worn smooth at the edges. "I want to ask something of you," he said. She stepped closer, brushing snow from her shoulders. "In 2 days, the snow moon rises. We mark it with a joining." Florence felt the world still. "I want you beside me," he said. "Not just in the night. In all things." She placed her hand over his, over the leather he held. "Yes," she said. They stood like that, palms joined, the cold forgotten. When the snow moon rose, the camp gathered in the canyon's wide bowl, where the cliffs caught the wind and turned it soft. Florence wore a dress of white doeskin, its edges beaded with fire-colored stones. Nayli had braided her hair with rivergrass and bone, fingers gentle, eyes bright. Ziah stood across from her, bareheaded, his hair tied with a single red cord. One of the elders stepped between them and spoke words in low tones, words Florence didn't yet know but felt all the same. When the elder stepped back, Ziah took her hands. "I will carry the weight with you," he said. "And I will walk beside you," she answered. The people around them raised their hands, not in applause but in witness. The fire behind them burned low and strong. That night, inside their shelter, Florence lay with her head against Ziah's chest, listening to the quiet rise and fall of his breath. "We built this," she whispered. He ran his hand down the length of her spine. "And we will build more." Outside, the wind moved over the earth like a song half remembered. But inside, there was only warmth and breath, and the steadiness of two hearts that had found their home. The cabin took shape by the end of winter, each beam placed with care, each stone set close against the next to hold in warmth. It stood just below the juniper grove where Ziah had first told her his plan, half sheltered from the wind and facing the wide sky. Florence had helped stack every stone, her hands calloused and steady now, her back strong from the weeks spent working alongside him. She hadn't once turned from the work, not when the snow bit through her gloves, not when her fingers bled from smoothing the lime mortar with reeds. She had built a life before, somewhere else, but this one was different. This one she had chosen. Inside, the hearth was wide, cut from red rock and lined with old iron Ziah had traded for at the post. Florence had woven a rug of wool and hide to lay before it, not for decoration, but because she wanted something soft under their feet when the nights turned cold again. One morning, as the last frost melted from the stones, Ziah brought her to the edge of the small field they had cleared below the cabin. He carried a satchel slung over one shoulder, the weight of seed inside it shifting as he walked. "I traded with the Hopi men who passed through last moon," he said. "They gave me white corn, dry beans, melon." "Melon?" Florence's voice rose just slightly. "I've never had it in the desert." He crouched, pressing his hand into the dark earth. "They said it grows sweeter in dry soil." She knelt beside him, drawing her fingers through the furrows they dug days before. "Then we'll plant it, and wait." They worked until the sun stood high, the earth warm beneath their knees and the scent of turned soil rising like something sacred. When they finished, she leaned back on her heels and wiped her brow with her sleeve. "Do you think it will take?" she asked. Ziah looked out over the rows. "It already has." That evening, Nellie arrived with her husband and their newborn son wrapped tight against her chest. Florence held the child for a long time, her arms steady, her body still. The baby's breath tickled against her collarbone. Ziah watched from the corner of the hearth, his gaze unreadable until the others had gone. Then he crossed to her, slow and sure. "You held him like you've done it before," he said. "I remembered how I used to dream of it," she answered. He brushed her hair back from her temple. "We're ready now." It wasn't a promise. It was a statement, quiet and certain. And she knew he was right. Spring deepened. The field they'd planted sprouted with green. Florence dug a second plot near the cabin for herbs, taught by the elder woman who had once guarded the medicine tent. She worked with her sleeves rolled and her skirts tied to her knees, humming tunes from her childhood without realizing it. Ziah returned one afternoon with a small carved cradleboard strapped to his back. He set it on the table without a word. She traced the beadwork stitched into its edge. "Did you make this?" "No. It belonged to Taya. I kept it wrapped for a long time. I thought it might be needed again." Florence rested her hand against the smooth wood. "It will be." When the rains came in short, warm bursts, they spread buckets beneath the eaves and watched the water fill slowly. Ziah repaired the roof and added a second latch to the door. Florence hung bundles of dried sage and wild garlic from the rafters. One morning, she rose before Ziah and crouched beside the hearth, her hands slow on her belly. She waited until he stirred, then placed his hand over hers. "Are you ready to be a father again?" she asked. His brow furrowed, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he leaned forward and kissed her once, firm and quiet. "I never stopped being one," he said. "Now I get to begin again." The days passed in rhythm. Ziah hunted less and gathered more. Florence stopped lifting the water barrels herself. They moved in tandem without needing words, like they were walking the same path from different directions and had finally arrived at the same place. When the child came, it was just after the moon turned full. Nellie and the elder woman helped, their voices low and calm through the long night. Ziah waited outside, pacing the length of the cabin, his ears tuned to every sound. At dawn, Florence's voice called for him. He entered to find her propped against the furs, her hair damp against her cheeks, a small bundle pressed against her chest. "It's a girl," she said, her voice worn but steady. Ziah dropped to his knees beside them. Florence eased the child into his arms. "She has your hands," he said, staring at the tiny fingers curled near her chin. Florence smiled. "And you're quiet." They named her Atsa for the eagle that had circled overhead the morning Florence first felt her stir. She was born into a world of stone and firelight, of quiet mornings and strong arms, of a home built by choice and held by love. Years passed. The cabin weathered storms and heat, its walls darkened with smoke and time. The field bore fruit, the melons sweet just as promised. Atsa grew tall and sure, her laughter heard often from the grove where the spring still ran clear. Florence taught her to grind corn, to sew straight seams, to listen when the wind changed. Ziah taught her how to track deer and carve toys from cedar. She called them both with the same word, home. They never spoke of the cabin Florence had left behind. It belonged to a life that had stopped breathing the day she stepped into Ziah's shadow and took his hand. What they had now was not escape. It was arrival. One evening, as the sun dropped low and cast long shadows across the doorway, Florence sat beside Ziah on the bench he had carved the first winter. Atsa ran barefoot through the tall grass below, chasing a dog with more bark than sense. Florence leaned her head against Ziah's shoulder. "Are you content?" His hand found hers without looking. "I am full." She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of Atsa's laughter echo off the stone. It was not the life she'd been given. It was the one she had made, and it was whole.